On my wedding at 72, my children said, "We won't come. You're embarrassing the family. He's marrying you for money." They didn't show up, and I got married without them. But a week later, they found out that my new husband was— Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Callahan. I was born in 1952 in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where people waved at neighbors they didn't like and smiled through every ache. I learned that skill early. I used it for most of my life. For 41 years, I was married to Gerald Callahan. A good man, a quiet man, the kind who brought coffee without being asked and fixed the porch steps before you noticed they were loose. We raised 2 children together, my son, Richard, and my daughter, Patricia. We sent them to college. We danced at their weddings. We held their babies. And then, in the spring of 2018, Gerald sat down after breakfast and simply didn't get back up. Grief is a strange landlord. It moves in without warning and rearranges all your furniture. For 2 years after Gerald died, I lived in the house we'd shared for 3 decades in Maple Grove, outside Columbus. I kept his coffee mug on the counter until I didn't. I kept his reading glasses in the kitchen drawer until one Tuesday I put them in a box and drove it to the church donation bin and cried the whole way home. Life continued, the way it always does, not because you want it to, but because it doesn't ask permission. It was Patricia who first introduced me to the Silver Oaks Community Center, a gathering place for adults over 60 in our area. She said it would do me good to get out of the house. She was right, though she'd use that against me later. It was there, in the spring of 2020, at a watercolor class neither of us had any talent for, that I met Edward Whitmore. Edward was 74 years old, a retired civil engineer from Michigan who had moved to Columbus after his own wife passed, 3 years before Gerald. He was tall and unhurried, with silver hair and a habit of listening that most people his age had forgotten. He didn't try to impress me. He didn't perform. He simply sat next to me, looked at my terrible painting of a cardinal, and said, "You've got the color exactly right." He wasn't talking about the painting. We became friends slowly. Then more than friends, the way it happens when you're old enough to know that time is not something to waste. By the fall of 2021, we were having dinner twice a week. By winter, he was shoveling my driveway without asking. By the following spring, he told me he loved me, and I believed him, because he had shown me over and over in 100 small ways that no one who wanted something from me would have bothered with. When Edward asked me to marry him in March of 2024, I said yes without hesitation. I was 72 years old, and I was happy. Is that such an impossible thing? I told Richard first. He was quiet on the phone for a moment, the kind of quiet that has weight. And then he said, "Mom, how long have you actually known this man?" I told him 4 years. He said, "That's not very long." I reminded him that he had proposed to his wife, Karen, after 18 months. He said that was different. I asked why. He didn't answer directly. Patricia was more immediate. She came to the house that same week, sat down at my kitchen table, and folded her hands the way she does when she has prepared what she wants to say. "Mom," she said, "Edward is 69 years old. You're 72. You have the house, Dad's pension, the investments, and he has what exactly? A rented condo and a state engineer's retirement? Don't you think it's worth considering why he might want to marry you at this point in his life?" I looked at my daughter, my own daughter, whom I had nursed through fevers and heartbreaks and a miscarriage she hadn't told her husband about for 2 weeks, but had told me. And I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter. A kind of recognition. "Patricia," I said, "I think you should leave." She didn't, not right away. She sat there a while longer and said more things about the family, about appearances, about what people would think, about my judgment and my vulnerability. Richard called that evening to add his own version of the same argument. And then, 2 weeks later, when I told them both that Edward and I had set a date for June, they delivered their ultimatum. "We won't come," Richard said. "We won't be part of this. You're embarrassing yourself, Mom. You're embarrassing all of us. He's marrying you for the money. That's the only explanation." I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after he hung up. Was I frightened? Yes. Was I devastated? More than I expected. But was I wrong? Number one, I was certain I was not wrong. For 3 days after Richard's call, I didn't leave the house. I want to be honest about that. I want to be honest because I think people expect women my age to be either fragile or superhuman, and I was neither. I was simply a woman sitting in her kitchen, drinking tea that went cold, staring out at the backyard where Gerald had built a bird feeder 20 years ago that was still standing. I cried. I am not ashamed to say it. I cried for my children, not for myself, but for the image I'd carried of them, for the people I believed they were. Patricia, whom I thought understood what loneliness felt like. Richard, who called me every Sunday and asked how I was in a voice that always sounded like he already knew the answer. I cried because love, real love, does not disappear in an instant, even when it has been handed back to you still warm. But grief and certainty can exist at the same time. I knew that from Gerald. On the 4th day, I made a list. Not an emotional list, a practical one. I sat down at the dining room table with a yellow legal pad, the kind Gerald used for his project notes, and I wrote down everything I owned. The house on Birchwood Lane, valued at approximately $380,000. Gerald's pension, which I still received monthly. Our joint investment account, which had grown quietly over the decades into something neither of us had fully expected. A small amount in a savings account. Gerald's life insurance, which had long since been settled. Then I wrote down what my children were afraid of losing, because that, I had realized, was the real question. Not whether Edward loved me, not whether I was making a mistake. The real question was, what were Richard and Patricia actually protecting? Richard's wife, Karen, had twice asked me, in what she clearly believed were casual conversations, whether I had a will and whether it was up to date. Patricia's husband, Dave, had made a comment at Christmas 2 years ago about estate planning that lingered longer than it should have. I had noted these things at the time and filed them away, the way you file away things that don't yet make sense. They were making sense now. I called my attorney, a woman named Helen Marsh, whom Gerald and I had worked with since the early 1990s. I told her I was planning to remarry. She congratulated me warmly and without hesitation, which I appreciated. Then I told her about my children's reaction. There was a brief pause, and Helen said, "Dorothy, I think we should talk in person." We met at her office on a Tuesday. I drove myself, which my children had also recently begun questioning. My driving, my independence, my ability to make decisions. Helen was direct and clear, the way I needed her to be. She explained my options carefully. A prenuptial agreement could be drafted to protect the assets I brought into the marriage, to ensure that in the event of my death, the estate would be distributed as I wished, rather than subject to spousal claims. She said this was entirely standard for second marriages later in life, and that it would, in fact, address my children's stated concerns directly. I asked her to draw it up. When I told Edward about the prenuptial agreement that evening, over dinner at the Italian place on 5th Street, where we always ordered the same things, he put down his fork, looked at me steadily, and said, "Of course. Whatever makes you comfortable, Dorothy. I'm not marrying you for a house." He signed it, without amendment, the following week. That was when something in me went very quiet. Not the quiet of defeat, the quiet of confirmation. A man who is marrying you for your money does not sign a prenuptial agreement without negotiation. A man who loves you signs it because he understands that your peace of mind matters more to him than any legal advantage. I did not tell Richard or Patricia about the prenuptial agreement. Not yet. I was learning, perhaps late in life but not too late, that information is not always best shared immediately. Sometimes you hold it. Sometimes you wait. I began to think more carefully about what I actually wanted. Not just for the wedding, but beyond it. I thought about the will Helen and I had discussed, which named Richard and Patricia as equal beneficiaries, but which I was now reconsidering. Not out of revenge, I told myself. Out of clarity. Out of the recognition that the people who receive your estate should be people who respect the life you chose to live. I was 72 years old. I had earned every dollar and every year, and I was beginning, for perhaps the first time, to think about them entirely on my own terms. The wedding was scheduled for the 14th of June. There was planning to do, and I intended to do it. I had never planned a wedding without Gerald. 30 years ago, he had stood beside me while we chose flowers and argued mildly about the reception menu, and he had ultimately deferred to me on everything except the song for the first dance, which had to be Sinatra, and which I had agreed to without protest. Planning this wedding was different. There was no one standing beside me in the same way, but there was Edward, who called every morning at 8 o'clock and always asked what he could do to help. And there was my friend Carolyn, a woman I'd known for 20 years, who showed up on a Saturday morning with a yellow notepad of her own and announced that she was, for all practical purposes, my wedding coordinator. Carolyn was 70 years old and had been divorced twice and remarried once and was, therefore, a credible authority on second ceremonies. She had opinions about flowers. I let her have them. We chose a small venue, a garden event space attached to a historic inn about 20 minutes outside Columbus. 40 guests. No grand display. Just the people I wanted around me, which was, it turned out, not a very long list. Most of my closest friends. A few of Edward's relatives from Michigan. Carolyn, obviously. My neighbor Frank, who had known Gerald and had sent Edward a warm, handwritten note when he heard the news. The kind of gesture I had not expected and would not forget. Richard and Patricia were not on the guest list. They had told me they would not come. I took them at their word. What I did not expect was the campaign that followed. Patricia called 3 times the week after I booked the venue. The first call was about the wedding itself. She repeated her concerns about Edward, about the speed of the relationship, about what she called my emotional state. I listened, said I understood her concerns, and said nothing else. The second call was about the house. She wanted to know whether I was planning to add Edward to the deed. I told her that was between me and my attorney. The third call was brief and tight, with something she was trying not to say, and she ended it by telling me I was being willfully naive. Richard, meanwhile, did something I did not anticipate. He called Helen Marsh. Helen told me about it at our next meeting. He had called her office, identified himself as my son, and asked whether she could confirm that I was competent to make legal decisions. He used that phrase. Competent. Helen had handled it professionally and told him she could not discuss my affairs, but she informed me immediately, as she was obligated to do. I sat in her office and felt the floor shift slightly under me. He's trying to establish grounds to challenge the wedding, Helen said carefully, or the will eventually. He's creating a paper trail suggesting you might not be of sound mind. She paused. Have you had any recent conversations with him that could be interpreted as confusion? Forgetfulness? I thought about it. I thought about the phone call 2 months ago when Richard had asked me 3 times whether I remembered his birthday dinner from 2 years back, which had seemed at the time like nostalgia and now seemed like something else entirely. I want to document everything, I told Helen. She nodded. I've already started. That same week, a letter arrived. Not to me, to Edward. It was addressed to his condo, from a return address I didn't recognize. Edward brought it to dinner and set it on the table between us without opening it. He said he had received it that morning and hadn't opened it because he thought I should be there when he did. We opened it together. It was from Richard's attorney, not Helen, a different lawyer, someone I had never heard of. The letter was careful and legalistic, but the core of it was plain. It suggested that Edward was engaged in a relationship with a vulnerable older woman for the purpose of financial exploitation, and that if the marriage proceeded, the family reserved the right to pursue legal action. Legal action? My son was threatening to sue my fiancé. Edward set the letter down. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at me. What would you like to do? He asked. Is that not extraordinary? Not. This is outrageous. I am furious. Not. Perhaps we should reconsider. Just, what would you like to do? I would like, I said slowly, to proceed. And I would like Helen to respond. Helen responded. Her letter was 3 paragraphs long and stated, among other things, that her client was a competent adult, that a prenuptial agreement had already been executed protecting all premarital assets, and that any further communication of this nature would be treated as harassment. Richard did not call me for 2 weeks after that. Patricia sent a text message that said only, "You're making a terrible mistake." I kept both the text and the letter. I was keeping everything now. The will was the plan. Not because I wanted to hurt my children. I want to be clear about that, even now, looking back. It was not an act of revenge. It was an act of clarity, of finally seeing what my estate meant and deciding with full consciousness what I wanted it to mean. Helen and I had several more meetings. We went through every asset carefully: the house, the investments, Gerald's pension, the savings. I had also, some years earlier, taken out a small life insurance policy of my own, separate from the one Gerald left me, naming Richard and Patricia as beneficiaries as a matter of course. I reviewed that too. The new will I signed in May of 2024, 1 month before the wedding, did several things. It provided for Edward, modest provisions, nothing extravagant. A man who did not want or need my money, but who deserved to be protected by it, should I go first. It established a charitable trust to receive a meaningful portion of the estate, directed toward the hospice organization that had cared for Gerald in his final weeks, a gift I had long wanted to make and kept deferring. And it adjusted the portions for Richard and Patricia. They were not cut out entirely, but they were no longer equal or primary. I did not tell them. What I did tell them, what I decided in early May to tell them, was that I had named Edward in the will at all, a small disclosure, carefully timed. I asked Helen how to do it in a way that was factually accurate but strategically placed. She understood. Richard found out from Karen, who heard it from Patricia, who had apparently been speaking to her own attorney, who had asked the right questions of the wrong people. The call came on a Wednesday morning, while I was in the garden, deadheading the rose bushes Gerald had planted the spring before he died. You put him in the will. Richard's voice was flat and cold. You actually put a stranger in Dad's will. It is not your father's will, I said. It is mine. This is insane, Mom. This man has... You've known him 4 years. 4 years. Do you have any idea how easy it is to manipulate someone in your... He stopped. In my what, Richard? He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The word he hadn't said floated there between us: condition, situation, age. Patricia and I are coming over, he said. This weekend. We need to talk about this properly. You are welcome to come, I said, but there is nothing to discuss. They arrived Saturday morning, both of them with their spouses. Karen and Dave, people I had known for decades, people who had eaten at my table, walked in behind my children with the expressions of people attending an intervention, which is, I suppose, exactly what they believed it was. They sat in my living room. Karen had brought a coffee cake, which struck me as either very kind or deeply tactical, and I couldn't decide which. Patricia did most of the talking. She laid out her case methodically. My age, my isolation since Gerald's death, the speed of the relationship with Edward, the obvious financial motivation, the will, the wedding. She was not unkind in tone, which made it worse. She spoke about me as if I were a case file. When she finished, I said, Helen Marsh has all of the documentation, the prenuptial agreement, Edward's financial records, which he provided voluntarily, his pension, his assets, his background check. Background check? Richard said. I am 72 years old, I said, not 17. I had him checked. He has no debt, no criminal history, no prior civil actions. He was married for 38 years to a woman named Ruth. His children, he has 2 in Michigan, speak highly of him. I have met them both. Have you? The room was quiet. Dave started to say something about protecting the family legacy, and I stood up. I stood up, which I don't often do mid-conversation, and I said, This house, this family, this legacy, I built it with your father, and I will decide what becomes of it. I will hear no more today. They left, not warmly. Richard sat at the door, quietly, privately, so only I could hear. You're going to regret this. He did not say it like a warning. He said it like a promise. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a long moment. My hands were steady, which surprised me. My heart was not quite steady, but it was moving forward, which I decided was enough. After they left, I called Carolyn. I told her what had happened. She said, Good. Now go lie down. I did. I took 4 days mostly for myself. Long walks, quiet mornings, a novel I'd been meaning to read for a year. I let Edward bring dinner on Thursday, and we sat on the porch and said very little, and that was exactly right. The wedding was 3 weeks away. The call came from Patricia on a Tuesday, while I was at the nursery choosing pots of lavender for the inn's garden tables at the reception. Her voice was different this time, softer. The hard edge of the Saturday confrontation had been replaced with something studied and careful, the tone of someone who has thought very deliberately about what register to use. Mom, she said, I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I want to apologize. I handled things badly. I was standing between rows of potted herbs, lavender and rosemary and sage, and I felt a familiar flicker. The instinct, trained over decades of motherhood, to respond to an apology with warmth and reconciliation. The instinct to say, Of course, sweetheart. I understand. I let it pass. I appreciate you saying so, I said. I want to make it right, she continued. We all do. Richard, too. We were scared for you, Mom, and we went about it the wrong way. But we love you, and we want to be part of your life. A pause. We want to come to the wedding. How easy it would have been to say yes. How deeply a part of me wanted to. But I had learned, over these past months, to listen not just to the words, but to the architecture of them. The what and the when and the why now. Why now? The wedding was 2.5 weeks away. The will was signed. The prenuptial was signed. What had changed? I'm very glad to hear that you're feeling differently, I said. Let me think about it and I'll call you back. Mom, the venue. I'll call you back, I said, and ended the call. I finished choosing the lavender. I paid for it. I drove home, put the kettle on, and sat at the kitchen table with my phone face down and thought carefully. The offer felt like a gift, but gifts can be Trojan horses. If Patricia and Richard came to the wedding, came back into the circle, what came with them? What conversations would be had with Edward's relatives? What would Karen say to whom? What new observation about my state would find its way into a legal document somewhere? I did not call Patricia back that day. Instead, I drove to Carolyn's house. Carolyn has a small back porch with a pergola she built herself, partly, and she makes very good iced tea from actual tea rather than powder. We sat there, and I told her everything. The call, the soft voice, the apology, the instinct I'd felt and then stepped back from. Carolyn listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Dorothy, do you actually believe she's sorry?" I thought about it honestly. "I believe she's frightened," I said. "I think she's realized that I'm serious, and I think she's trying a different tactic." Carolyn nodded. "So what do you want?" What did I want? Not punishment, not warfare, but not false peace either. Not the performance of family harmony over a truth that everyone in the room knew was a performance. "I want my wedding to be my wedding," I said, "not a negotiation." Carolyn raised her glass. "Then have it." I also, around this time, found a support group I hadn't known to look for. Helen's paralegal, a young woman named Jessie, mentioned that there were organizations, not grief groups, not seniors centers, but actual networks of older adults navigating family conflict over remarriage and estate decisions. She gave me a contact. I called. I started attending a small monthly meeting at a community center on the north side of Columbus, 6 or 7 people, mostly women, mostly in their 60s and 70s. What I found there was not pity and not advice. It was recognition, woman after woman, with some version of the same story. Children who had been warm and attentive until the estate came into view. Partners who were treated as criminals for the crime of arriving after the first spouse. The particular loneliness of being seen not as a person, but as an asset to be managed. I wept once at the second meeting. A woman named Barbara, 78, sharp as a tack, who had been through a legal guardianship attempt by her own son, put her hand over mine and said, "You're not crazy. You're not naive. They are simply not as good as you hoped." I carried that sentence with me the way you carry a smooth stone, something to hold when the weight of it all became hard to manage. Patricia called again Thursday. I did not answer. I sent a text. "I'm still thinking. I'll be in touch before the wedding." I did not say yes. I did not say no. I said nothing that could be used. They came on a Sunday, 9 days before the wedding. Unannounced. I was in the kitchen making oatmeal. Simple, ordinary Sunday morning, when the doorbell rang. I looked through the window before opening it, because I had started doing that, and I saw Richard's car in the driveway. I also saw Patricia's. I stood at the door for a moment. I breathed. I thought about not answering. Then I thought about what kind of woman I wanted to be, not the kind who hides in her own kitchen from her own children. And I opened it. Richard was holding flowers. Not from a grocery store, from a florist, wrapped in paper, the kind of flowers you choose deliberately. Patricia was carrying a box from the bakery down the street. "Chocolate croissants," she said, still warm. Karen and Dave were not with them. Just the two of them, my children, standing on my porch with offerings and cautious expressions. "We should have called," Richard said. "I know, but I was afraid you wouldn't answer." He wasn't wrong. I let them in. I made coffee. We sat at the table, the same table where Patricia had delivered her first structured argument months ago, and for 20 minutes we talked about other things. Richard's youngest son starting high school in September. Patricia's garden, which had apparently done well this year despite a late frost. The kind of conversation we used to have effortlessly on Sunday afternoons when the children were younger and nobody had anything to calculate. The kind I missed, I realized, more than I had let myself acknowledge. There was a specific ache to it, not the broad ache of estrangement, but the precise one of remembering that these were people I had once known completely. Then Richard set down his cup and looked at me directly. Mom, we're not here to fight. We want to make this right. We want to come to the wedding. He glanced at Patricia, who nodded. But we need to know that you've really thought through the implications. All of it. I have, I said. The will, he said. Patricia and we're not asking for anything that isn't ours. But Dad worked his whole life to build something for this family. That's not nothing. And to have a stranger come in and... Edward is not a stranger, I said. And it is not your father's will. There are implications, Patricia said, leaning forward. Her voice was gentle, but her eyes were not. Legal implications. If something happened to you, Dorothy, Mom, and Edward contested anything, it could take years. It could be ugly. We're just asking you to protect yourself. Protect yourself. As if my protection was their concern. As if the woman being protected and the woman being managed were not, in this case, the same person. I noticed that she had called me Dorothy rather than Mom for the first part of that sentence. I noticed it, and I filed it. The prenuptial agreement is signed, I said. Helen has the will. Everything is in order. Would you be willing, Richard said, carefully, slowly, the way you approach something fragile, to hold off on the wedding? Just 6 months? Get a second opinion, not from Helen, from someone else, a geriatric care specialist, just to make sure. I set down my own cup. A geriatric care specialist, I repeated. Mom, you want me to see a specialist, I said, to verify that I am mentally fit to make decisions about my own life. The room was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. Small, ordinary sounds filling an extraordinary silence. We're not saying you're not, Patricia started. You are, though, I said. That is exactly what you are saying, and I want you to hear me clearly. I looked at both of them, one and then the other, the way I had looked at them when they were small and had done something serious and needed to understand that I meant every word. I had Helen document everything months ago. My mental acuity, my decision-making capacity, it's on record. 2 witnesses, a notary, and my physician's written assessment. Because I knew from the moment Richard called Helen's office where this was going. Patricia's expression flickered. Something behind her eyes shifted. Surprise. And then something harder. How did you know about that? Richard said. Because Helen told me, I said, as she was required to, and because I am not naive, and I am not confused, and I am not, as you both seem to wish I were, incompetent. Richard stood up. The warmth was gone now entirely, and what replaced it was not anger exactly, but a kind of cold exposure, the look of someone whose plan has been seen through and who no longer has any interest in the costume they came in. He looked at me the way strangers look at someone who has surprised them on the street. Unfamiliar. Recalibrating. You're making a choice that affects this entire family, he said. I am making a choice about my life, I said. You are not my family's trustee. You are my children. There is a difference. Patricia picked up her bakery box. She didn't say anything. At the door, Richard turned back once and said, We won't be at the wedding. The same thing he'd said before, as if saying it again gave it more power. I know, I said. I closed the door and stood in the hallway. My breath was controlled, but my chest was tight and my eyes were hot. I gave myself a moment, just a moment, to feel the full weight of it. These were my children. The people I had chosen not to love, because you don't choose that, but to build my life around. and they were standing on the other side of my door, and they were strangers wearing familiar faces. Was I frightened? Honestly, yes. Not of them, exactly, but of the long path still ahead, of the grinding possibility of a legal battle at an age when I wanted nothing more than peace and morning coffee and the company of a man who asked what I needed before I asked myself, of the loneliness that might settle in if I let it. Not the grief loneliness of losing Gerald, but the stranger loneliness of being misunderstood by people who were supposed to know you best. But fear, I had learned, does not have to be the end of the sentence. Sometimes it is merely the beginning of what comes next. I let the fear exist. I didn't fight it or dismiss it. I simply noted that it was there, alongside something else, something quieter and steadier, that had not moved at all. I picked up the phone and called Edward. The 14th of June arrived with clear skies and a humidity that my knees registered before my eyes did. Carolyn arrived at 8 in the morning with a travel steamer for my dress and the calm efficiency of a woman who had decided that today was going to be exactly right. And so it was going to be. She adjusted my collar, handed me a glass of water I hadn't thought to pour for myself, and said, "You look wonderful," in a voice that didn't leave room for argument. I believed her. The inn was 20 minutes outside Columbus, in a township where the landscape opens up and there are actual trees, not parking lots, between buildings. The garden had been set with 40 white chairs, lavender on every table, and a trellis at the front wound with climbing roses that the inn's owner, a woman named Janet, had tended for 15 years. Janet had added a detail I hadn't asked for. Small glass votives along the stone path, not yet lit in the morning light, but catching it anyway. It was, I thought, looking at it, exactly what I would have chosen if I had been allowed to choose only what was real. Edward arrived before me. He was standing at the edge of the garden when my car pulled in, wearing a dark suit and the expression of a man who had been waiting for something good for a very long time and had finally stopped being surprised by it. He saw me through the window and something in his face changed very slightly. I saw it, and I held it, and I carried it with me into the day. What I want to tell you about next happened before the ceremony, perhaps an hour before. I was in the small room they had given me to dress in at the back of the inn when Carolyn came and told me that Richard and Patricia were outside. Not inside. Outside. In the parking lot. In Richard's car. She had seen them when she went to bring in the lavender centerpieces from her trunk. She had stood there for a moment, watching the car, before she came to tell me. "They didn't come in," Carolyn said, watching my face carefully. "They're just sitting there." I thought about that. I thought about what their presence meant and what their not coming in meant, and what the car in the parking lot meant, strategically. Were they waiting to see if I would falter? Were they hoping to be invited? Were they simply unable to leave and unable to enter, caught in the doorway of a choice they'd made and couldn't take back? I felt, unexpectedly, a wash of something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite sorrow. Something in between, with no good name. I asked Carolyn to invite them inside. She looked at me with the expression of a woman who has known me for 20 years and is choosing not to say everything she is thinking. "Dorothy, I want them to see it," I said, "not to gloat. I want them to see that it is real, and that it is good, and that I am all right." She went, and they came. They came into the back hallway of the inn, Richard in a jacket he clearly hadn't planned to wear today, and Patricia in the clothes she'd put on for something else. Not dressed for a wedding, dressed for surveillance. They stood in the doorway of the room I was in and looked at me. In my dress, hair done, bouquet waiting on the table beside me, ready. And something moved through both of their faces that I recognized as something they hadn't intended me to see. grief. Not for me. For something they had already decided was lost. You came, I said. We're not staying, Richard said. We're not. Mom, we need you to hear us one more time, please, before you do this. I'm listening, I said. And then something happened that I had not entirely anticipated, though I had wondered in the long hours of these months whether it might. The pressure of the morning, the proximity of the moment, the fact that time had run out. All of it seemed to dissolve the last layer of careful presentation they had maintained. Richard started talking about the house, about the account numbers, about specific figures, the investment portfolio to the dollar, that he should not have known unless he had been told by someone with access to documents that were not his. He talked about our share and what Dad intended and the inheritance. He made an error, then corrected it, which told me the figure had been verified elsewhere. He talked as a man who had been rehearsing this argument and had finally run out of time to wait for a better moment. And as he talked, the mask of parental concern slipped entirely. And what was underneath was not love or even fear. It was inventory. Patricia said less but confirmed more. She mentioned a conversation with Dave's attorney, not Helen, about spousal elective share laws in Ohio, about the percentages a spouse could claim, about whether Edward would have grounds to petition after my death. She named a percentage. She cited a statute. She had done the research. She had been doing it for months, carefully, methodically, the way you research something you intend to use. I looked at my daughter and I thought, when did this begin? Was it recent? Was it Edward and the wedding that uncovered this? Or had it always been there, dormant, waiting for the right conditions? I thought of all the Sunday phone calls and the holiday dinners and the times I had believed completely that I was loved simply because I was their mother. Had any of that been inventory too? Or had something curdled only later when the numbers became large enough to matter? I would never fully know. And I had made my peace with not knowing. You've been preparing a legal case, I said. We've been protecting ourselves, Richard said. From what? I'm not dead. Mom, you have been treating my life as a problem to be managed, I said. The calm in my voice surprised even me. Not because I had manufactured it, but because it was genuine. The calm of someone who has arrived, finally, at the place where uncertainty ends. You called Helen to question my competency. Richard, you hired a lawyer to write threatening letters to my fiancé. Patricia, you've been consulting estate attorneys about laws that will only apply when I am gone. You've been doing all of this while calling me Mom, while bringing flowers to my door, while carrying bakery boxes still warm. Patricia's face was red now. We have every right to protect what Dad— Your father left his estate to me, I said clearly. Not to you, to me, his spouse, as was his right. And what I do with my own estate, my own life, my own choices, is mine. You have no claim on it while I am living. You have no legal standing. And you have, in the past several months, made very clear what kind of standing you believe you deserve. Richard looked at me with something that might have been hate, might have been helplessness, might have been the look of someone confronting the possibility that they have misread everything. His voice, when it came, was quieter than before. Not calmer, but depleted. You're going to regret this, he said. I regretted many things, I said. Mostly the time I wasted wondering whether I was wrong about you. I stood, unhurried, completely steady. The ceremony begins in 35 minutes. You are welcome to stay, or you are welcome to leave. Both are acceptable to me, but this conversation is finished. They left. I heard the car start in the parking lot through the inn window. I stood still and listened to it pull away. Down the gravel drive, past the roses, out of the gate. The sound of it grew smaller and then was gone. And in the silence that followed, I felt the particular lightness of something that had been suspended for a very long time, finally settling into its right place. Then Carolyn handed me my bouquet, white roses and lavender, and straightened my collar one last time, and I walked out to the garden. Edward was waiting for me at the trellis. 40 people stood when I appeared at the back of the garden, which I had not expected. And the sight of them, Carolyn in her blue dress, and Frank from next door who had known Gerald and stood with his hat over his heart, and the women from my support group with Barbara already dabbing her eyes, and Edward's daughter Claire and his son Michael, who had driven from Michigan and had never made me feel anything other than welcome, moved me in a way I had not prepared for. I had prepared for the absence of my children. I had not fully prepared for the presence of everyone else, for the fact that 40 people had chosen to be here today for me. The path to the trellis was stone, lined with small votives Janet had added, and the lavender was on every table, and the roses on the trellis were open and soft in the morning light. I walked slowly, not because my legs required it, because I wanted to feel every step. The ceremony was conducted by a retired minister named Robert, who had a talent for saying true things simply. He had met with Edward and me twice before the wedding, wanting to understand what we actually wanted said, and he had listened in the particular way that some people have, not waiting to respond, but genuinely receiving. What he said at the trellis that morning was short and honest and unadorned. Edward and I had written our own vows, which is something I would not have been brave enough to do at 32, but found, at 72, to be the only thing that made sense. What is the point of borrowed words when you have lived long enough to have your own? Edward said that he had not expected to find this, that he had made a careful peace with what his life was going to look like, quieter, smaller, sufficient, that he had resolved not to ask for more than what remained. And then I had walked into a watercolor class and ruined his peace entirely, which was, he said, the best thing that had happened to him in years. He paused, looked at me, and added that my painting of the cardinal had genuinely been very good. And the room laughed, and I laughed, and it was the kind of laughter that arrives only when joy is completely undefended. I said that I had learned, later than I should have, that love at this age is not a compromise with reality. It is not settling. It is a refusal to accept that what remains of life must be only maintenance. That Edward had shown me, in 4 years of small and consistent acts, what a man of integrity looks like when no one is watching. That I had watched, and I had seen it, and I had trusted what I saw. We exchanged rings. Robert said the words. We were married. The reception was in the garden, and then inside, as the afternoon cooled into evening. Edward's son, Michael, made a toast that was funny and sincere in equal measure. He mentioned that his father had called him about me before our second date, which Edward denied, and Michael produced a dated text message, which the room received with great appreciation. Carolyn made a toast that made 3 people cry, including me, because she had known me through Gerald's dying and the dark years after, and said things only she had the right to say. Edward danced with me, carefully and without pretension, to Sinatra. I had asked for it as a nod to Gerald, and Edward had agreed without hesitation and without any visible complexity, which told me everything about the kind of man he was. In the weeks that followed, the legal situation resolved with the finality of a door being closed from the outside. Helen had been thorough in ways Richard and Patricia had not anticipated. The documentation of my mental competency, physician's written assessment, notarized capacity statements, the complete record of every significant decision, was unassailable. Richard had spent months trying to build a paper trail, suggesting diminished capacity, and he had built nothing because there was nothing to build it from. His attorney reviewed everything Helen provided and delivered the verdict plainly: no viable case. No judge would entertain a competency challenge against a woman whose physician had recently documented full cognitive function, who had executed a prenuptial agreement, a revised will, and a charitable trust, all within the same calendar year, all with independent legal counsel present. Richard paid his attorney's fees and received nothing for them except the clarity of knowing the route was closed. The charitable trust was established exactly as written. The hospice that had cared for Gerald in his final weeks received a gift I had owed them for years. Edward's provision was modest and settled. The remainder was structured as Helen and I had decided. Patricia and Richard received their portions, reduced but not insubstantial, distributed while I was still living. Once they had received what they were going to receive, while I was present and well and legally unimpeachable, there was nothing further to contest. The motivation for any remaining legal action dissolved with the transfer. Patricia did not respond to Helen's letter. No call, no acknowledgement, just silence. Richard sent a text on a Thursday afternoon. Fine. One word. The entire collapsed architecture of months of scheming and threatening and maneuvering reduced to 4 letters on a phone screen. I showed it to Edward. He read it, handed the phone back, and said, "Hungry? I was thinking the Italian place." We went. We sat at our usual table, ordered what we always ordered. The waiter brought the bread without being asked. Edward told a small, funny story about something at the community center. I listened, and outside the window, Columbus went on as it always did, and inside it was warm, and neither of us said anything significant for the rest of the evening, because nothing significant needed to be said. We drove home to the house on Birchwood Lane. I sat on the porch in the evening air. Gerald's bird feeder stood where it had always stood. A pair of sparrows were settling into the elm for the night, without drama, without performance, simply finding the right branch and being still. Edward came out with 2 cups of tea, set one beside me, and took the chair next to mine. We didn't speak for a long time. Everything that needed to happen had happened. Everything that needed to be built had been built, and it had held. And I was sitting inside it now, in the quiet, next to a man who had meant every word he had ever said. I was 72 years old. I was married. My life was peaceful. I had not burned anything. I had simply built something that could not be argued with, and then I had lived inside it without apology. The first year of our marriage was the most quietly contented year of my adult life. We lived in the house on Birchwood Lane. Edward kept his condo for 6 months, then gave it up without ceremony when it became clear I had not overestimated anything. He cooked on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I cooked the other nights, except Sundays, which were for the Italian place. He fixed things around the house, carefully, competently, not to perform helpfulness, but because the porch steps were uneven, and that was simply a problem to be solved. We traveled modestly, but meaningfully. We drove to Michigan in September to see Michael's new house, where I met his children, a girl of 6 and a boy of 4 who were briefly, genuinely interested in me, which children that age only are when they find you slightly strange, and I took as a compliment. We went to Charleston in March, where the spring flowers were extraordinary, and we walked more than my knees approved of and didn't regret a step. I continued attending the support group, not because I still needed it for myself, but because new members arrived who did, and because Barbara and I had become genuine friends. She called on my first wedding anniversary and asked, "How are you?" in the voice of someone who actually wanted to know. So small a thing. Still, it moved me. Carolyn held Sunday dinners once a month. Edward fit into the table the way he fit into most things, without friction, without performance, with the simple reliability of a person who has decided who he is. Now, what of Richard and Patricia? I want to say I took no satisfaction in what followed. I'm not certain that's entirely true. Richard and Karen separated in the spring following the wedding. The details weren't shared with me, but the broad outline reached me through Frank. The marriage had long harbored fault lines, and the months of conflict over my estate had surfaced them in ways that didn't close afterward. Richard moved to an apartment in Westerville, alone, for the first time since his 20s. He had also billed enough to legal fees trying to challenge my decisions that he had drawn on savings he could not entirely afford. Patricia and Dave did not separate, but something between them had calcified. She had spent months obsessing over an inheritance already legally settled and had alienated several mutual friends in the process. She and I had not spoken in almost a year. She called once in December. I answered. She said she wasn't sure she'd done the right thing. I said I wasn't sure either. We left it there. Not reconciliation, not nothing. Two people acknowledging, with some fatigue, that they were still connected, and neither quite knew what to do with that yet. I did not push. I did not close the door. I left it as it was. Meanwhile, Edward and I planted a climbing yellow rose bush in the backyard beside Gerald's bird feeder. He had admired it at the inn where we married. I had ordered it in October without telling him, and when it arrived, he looked at it for a long moment, then looked at me and said nothing. The nothing he said was very full. We were, at 72 and 75, unremarkably and completely happy. Is that not enough? Is that not, in fact, everything? I learned that happiness in old age is not embarrassing. That your children's fear of losing an inheritance is not the same as love, no matter how many warm croissants they bring to your door. And that protecting yourself legally is not cynicism. It is wisdom earned the hard way. If someone had treated you the way my children treated me, would you have had the courage to say yes anyway? Leave your answer in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And thank you, sincerely, for listening.